Hi all, and welcome to our first online lecture of the semester, probably the first of a fair few, as long as this goes okay and I'm able to figure out how YouTube works and all of the following. Hopefully all of you found everything so far okay online. So the midterm, which almost all of you have done, and still been able to find the readings, etc. Hopefully this transition online should be fairly straightforward. Like, I've tried to use the kind of media that you're going to be able to access easily, and I'm going to use Google Forms for the reading responses and so on. So hopefully that should be, again, very straightforward because you just submit those through the Google form online, and then I will have all of your responses in one place and I'll be able to look at them and then respond if necessary to sort out any misconceptions or so on the following week. Okay, so today, or this week I guess, whenever you choose to look at this slide set, whenever you choose to do the readings, because each week I really don't mind how you choose to structure your lives now that things are as crazy and structureless as they are. Oh, and of course, I hope, probably should have started with this, but of course I hope that you're all doing okay, that you're not overly panicked, that you're able to occupy yourselves. Maybe you've picked up a few fun hobbies, etc., in these new times that we're living in. Okay, so today we're going to start our unit on ethics. So we'll start our unit on ethics. Ethics being just thinking about what the right things to do are, what kinds of actions are good, what kinds of actions are bad, what we ought to do when faced with moral dilemmas, ethical dilemmas, scenarios where there's a wrong and a right, a thing that we could do, but would that thing be good or would that thing be bad, right? So we're going to start the ethics component by looking at three different theories of ethical theory, right? So and these are going to be three different ways of determining what you ought to do when faced with a moral dilemma, or how you ought to act ethically, how you ought to act morally in the world. These three schools of thought are going to be Utilitarianism, which we're looking at this week, deontology or Kantian ethics, which we'll look at next week, and then virtue ethics, which we'll look at the week after. So for today, we'll start with utilitarianism. So first, briefly, what is moral philosophy? Like, what is it that we're doing in this section of the course? So very simply put, moral philosophy is just the study of morality and what it requires of us. So the study of how we should be acting, right? Like what we ought to do, what we ought not to do. It's looking at that, and I mean, this is the third bullet point here, but it's looking at what we ought to do, what the right thing, what the wrong thing is, and it's about giving reasons to support that, right? So it's one thing to say, oh, it's wrong to borrow an example from the last class we had, it's wrong for Simon to have stolen your car. Moral philosophy is about being able to say why it is wrong for him to have done that, right? Like, why was it wrong for you to tell that lie even though it was a white lie, right? The reasoning that you give for that is going to depend on the moral theory that you're subscribing to. So I've put here morality versus personal opinion, right? What is the difference between those two things? So morality is seen, as some other things are, as action guiding in a way that personal opinion isn't, right? So even though often people will say, well, morality is subjective, it's still the case that most of us think that morality is something that all of us ought to be abiding by, right? So when somebody does something that you think is bad, you might try and explain to them, like if a friend, if your parents, somebody in your family does something and you think it's a morally bad thing that they've done, and when you tell them why you think it's morally bad, what you're saying doesn't just have the weight of a personal opinion. It's not like you're saying, I think you're wrong to think that tomato soup is bad, right? That's a personal opinion. You might think somebody's wrong because you might think tomato soup's delicious, but you don't necessarily think, when you tell them why you think they're wrong, that they ought to change the way they're behaving based on the fact that you happen to like tomato soup. Morality is different to this because we generally think that people ought to be changing their behavior according to things that we think are moral or not moral, right? So if you say to somebody, it's really bad that you're hiding all this stuff from your parents, or it's really bad that you're misleading your parents in this way in order to steal money from them, or in order to take their money but not tell them what you're using your money for, right? Like, if you think that that's morally wrong and a friend is engaging in that kind of behavior, when you tell them what you think that they ought to change their behavior in response to that, right? So that's what I mean when I say that morality is seen as action guiding. And that's also why it's so important that we give reasons to support our conclusions, right? Reasons to support what we think are morally right or morally wrong, because we do generally think that people ought to change their behavior in response to that, right? And that's why we also have laws, right? Like, that's why we have laws prohibiting certain behaviors, because we think that everybody ought to not be doing those things because those things are bad. Most obviously, we have laws against murder because we think that nobody ought to be engaging in that kind of behavior because we think that it's bad to kill people, right? So, utilitarianism then is the theory that we're looking at this week. And this is probably the most common, the most famous kind of ethical theory, which essentially subscribes, and I gave you the John Stuart Mill, very short reading to look at, to explain what utilitarianism is. And utilitarianism, very simply put, and this is a quote lifted from the reading, is something like, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong in proportion as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So, in other words, utilitarianism, a thing that often people will use to describe utilitarianism, is it's producing the greatest good for the greatest number. So, in these 3 points I've got here that draw out the major facets of, like, the major components of utilitarianism, I've got 1, the morality of an action depends solely on its consequences. So by that, we mean that utilitarianism is a kind of ethical theory that's what we call a consequentialist theory. By that we mean it's the kind of thing where determining what the ethically right thing to do is depends only on looking at what will produce the best outcome, right? So this is in contrast to theories we'll look at next week and the week after, where you look at the rightness or the wrongness of an action, say. So this isn't the kind of theory that's like, you shouldn't do that because it's bad to lie to people, you shouldn't do that because it's bad to kill people. It would say something like, look, it's wrong for you to kill that person because the parents will be sad, other people will be sad, the world will be worse off, there will be less happiness in the world if you kill that person, therefore it's bad for you to kill that person, right? So that brings me on to point number 2 then, utilitarianism. The aim of utilitarianism, what we ought to be doing, right? Like, the way that we should be living ethical lives is generally we should be aiming to maximize happiness. So maximize the amount of pleasure in the world, the amount of happiness, the amount of joy, however you want to put that, and minimize suffering. So minimize pain, minimize people starving, minimize anything that will cause harm in the world, right? Anything that will detract from pleasure, etc. So the thing that the utilitarian thinks is the ethical thing is always going to be the thing that has the best consequences, where what it is for something to have the best consequences is for that thing to maximize happiness. Okay, so I think at this point I should probably give an example to illustrate that point. So this came up briefly in our last class, but the classic example that's often given to provoke the utilitarian instinct, like the intuition to make us think that this is plausible, which clearly it is plausible, right? Like, we all the time, we do think consequentially, we do think about how we ought to act in terms of, what could I do here that will make the most people happiest, right? What could I do here that, in a messy friendship situation, right, you're like, how can I act to piss off the least of my friends, right? How can I act to, like, whatever I do, my friend will be unhappy, but how can I make her the least unhappy she could be, right? Something like that. But the kind of case that is often used is this thing called the trolley problem. So this is just a very basic thought that there's a train, or trolley, I guess, running along a track and it's heading towards one person who's, let's say, tied to that track, right? You're on the train, you see this lever on the train, right? And if you pull the lever, then you'll divert the train from the track, this train that's about to hit one person who's tied to the track ahead of you. No. Okay, so there are 5 people on the track ahead of you, right? So you're on the trolley's hurtling towards these 5 people who are lying on the track. You see this lever, you can pull the lever. If you pull the lever, the train will divert and head to the left. And on that bit of track that you could divert the train onto, there's only one person, right? And then the question is something like, should you pull that lever or not? Clearly the utilitarian thing to do, the utilitarian recommendation, is that you ought to pull that lever because it's better if you have a scenario where either 5 people will die or one person will die. Clearly it's better for only one person to die, right? Like clearly sometimes in that kind of scenario, even though it is a bit of a lose-lose scenario, the intuition that we're supposed to have for the utilitarian is that generally, if you can choose between 2 courses of action, but one course of action will kill fewer people, will cause less suffering than the other one, then that's the thing that we ought to do, right? And that's how, if you think about it, that's how lots of things do operate, right? That's how, for example, triage in hospitals operates, right? Like that's how, if supplies aren't plentiful, I guess this is a very prescient conversation to be having right now, right? There's a sense in which the measures that various countries are taking, or the fact that we're all, at the moment, mostly self-isolating or something like that, right? Like that is governments making a kind of utilitarian decision that the best way to minimize suffering in the long run, right, the best way to try to make sure that hospital beds aren't overcrowded and that lots and lots of people don't die, right, is for all of us to make a kind of sacrifice now in order to try to maximize happiness in the future, try to minimize deaths, etc., right? So this kind of consequential thinking very much is the way that people think sometimes, right? Okay, the last thing to say about this slide, just number 3 here, this is just the condition that by talking about utilitarianism here, in assessing consequences, we ought to be impartial, right, according to the utilitarian. And by impartial, all we mean is something like, in assessing consequences, you have to pay attention to every individual's happiness in whatever ethical scenario you're in, right? So if you're making some kind of decision that's going to affect 10 people, when you're thinking about maximizing happiness, you have to consider the happiness of each of those people to an equal extent, right? So if there's 10 people, then 10% of the decision goes to like each person, right? So it's not, utilitarianism isn't the kind of doctrine, and some people think this sometimes, where if one person will be extremely, extremely happy because of a decision, but everyone else will be very sad, right? The fact that that one person is going to be extremely happy doesn't mean that that's the course of action you should take. More specifically, utilitarianism is not a doctrine that says that you get to do the thing that will make you the happiest, right? Sometimes people will say that, they'll be like, well, as a utilitarian, I here would do this because it would make me very unhappy not to do that. That's not the point, right? Like in a given scenario, you're trying to calculate how the happiness of that entire group of people can be maximized. Okay. Hopefully that should be clear.